When you go to buy a sports car, you really have two main options. You can get a car that has a more feminine design language, think Porsche or Ferrari or even the Miata. Or you can get something a bit more masculine, say a Mustang or a BMW. Or you could just get something ugly like the new Corvette. The same dichotomy exists for motorcycles, by the way. Compare, an MV Agusta Super Veloce with, say, a Ninja H2. They're both sport bikes, but they have completely different vibes. This topic of femininity in automotive design has always been important. All the way back in the 1950s, the likes of Edward Turner explicitly described designing motorcycles that are feminine. If you look at a Jaguar E-Type for too long, your wife is probably going to start getting jealous. But as the 60s and 70s and then really the 80s hit, many manufacturers turned to making more sharp, angular, masculine sports cars and sport bikes. And this is part of the reason the 60s is so alluring for classic vehicle enthusiasts, because in many ways it was kind of the end of that era of cars that were designed in a more feminine way. But there's one car that never really lost that feel. Even as sports cars and vehicles as a whole became sharper and boxier and also just had lots of elements of microaggression, this car stayed the same. Some have called it the single most feminine sports car, or really car in general, ever designed. I'm talking about the Alfa Romeo Duetto Spider. Roadster, speedster, convertible, spider. In the end, the main idea behind all of these really regional terms through automotive history has always been that of a small, top-down performance car. Despite the Roadster being known as a rather British export by the 1960s, prior to the introduction of the Spider, few manufacturers had made as many of these types of cars as the Italian company Alfa Romeo. From the massive 8-cylinder 2900B to the beautiful and stylish Pininfarina designed Giulietta Spider. In many ways, that car really laid the foundation for Alfa to sell a convertible that was both thoroughly Alfa, thoroughly Italian in form, while still being kind of mass-produced. But as the 1960s came around, the time would come for Alfa to make a new version of their popular Spider, a car that could carry and would carry them well into the future. Now, the roots of this new kind of convertible for Alfa go back about a decade before its release to the radical Pininfarina-designed Superflow, and especially the Superflow 2. From the nose to the side panels to the winged back, this form came out of a desire for better aerodynamics and on-road stability, but it would soon become really more of a key part of Alfa Romeo's automotive design language going forward. With these predecessors, Alfa would also experiment with a design that had the bodywork essentially sitting out over the wheels, something Jaguar would beat them to in terms of production. Mechanically speaking, this new car was essentially an evolution of the prior Giulia Spider 1600. It was a front-engine, rear-wheel drive, classic Italian roadster. Unlike most of the British roadsters, though, this car came standard with a 4-valve twin-cam engine, something Alfa had really perfected since they first introduced them all the way back in 1914. The 1570cc twin-cam inline-4 made about 108 horsepower with really very usable torque and power across the entire rev range. And the car weighed around 2,200 pounds, and it was unibody construction. Though the wheelbase was the same as the Giulietta Spider, the rest of the dimensions were down. And overall, it would prove to be a pretty raw sports car, especially in this early form. Battista and Sergio Pininfarina were tasked with designing the new car as a sort of evolution of what they'd done prior to it with Alfa and their previous Spiders. As much as this looks like an E-Type copy, we know from Alfa's prototype history that this Pininfarina design was really decades in the making, and Jaguar just happened to beat them to the punch in '62 when they released the E-Type. Alfa Romeo claimed at that time that the car was the product of wind tunnel testing. Though we can't outright deny this claim, the company never would really release any of the results of their testing, so who knows if it actually was. The car is beautiful, and that's really all that matters, and no doubt the performance benefits can be present on the car without wind tunnel testing. Again, look no further than the E-Type. That car looked like it was designed in a wind tunnel, and it was very aerodynamic, but it wasn't designed in a wind tunnel. The design of this new Spider overall has quite a few things that are noteworthy. The side view of the car shows one big but subtle curving line up to the middle and then back down to the back. Head on, the car is nothing but curves, but a closer look shows that these curves come to a point at the back and front in a really symmetrical way, though later on, that symmetry would kind of go away. Remember that car I mentioned earlier called the Superflow? At that time, it was referred to as a design based on osso di sepia, or cuttlefish bone, or cuttlebone. This idea would carry forward into the Spider 1600 Duetto. The cuttlebone is the internal structure of the cuttlefish. It has a very distinct round but sharp shape, and in the water this helps keep the cuttlefish buoyant. But for Alfa, the experiment was to use this basic shape for its potential aerodynamic benefits. And in this sense, the Spider 1600 departs quite a bit from, say, the E-Type's design, and you start to realize that the only real similarity between the two cars is the headlights and, the rounded side bodywork. But regardless, both cars are mostly curves. Though in my opinion, this car is much more feminine as a whole than the Jaguar E-Type. It's much less imposing. It's the kind of car you see and you just go, oh, that's a cute car. For the Alfa, the curves are broken up with this now iconic groove running from the front wheel arches to the tail section. Aside from apparent aerodynamic benefits, which could certainly be debated, this indentation apparently also helps with rigidity. Regardless of all of this, it helped the car stand out and feel rather modern, and it's pretty tough to deny that this design really worked for Alfa. The car would continue on virtually unchanged in terms of the overall looks into the 1990s. At points, it would actually go back to the original styling with the 4th generation Spider. So there were times that they made changes, but actually reverted back to an even more old school look for the car. The interior was thoroughly in line with previous Spider models from Alfa, with a classic Pininfarina touch kind of added, and that touch was rather Ferrari-esque. Between the big gauges and the readily available shifter, secondary center gauges that are positioned toward the driver, it's really a beautiful but simple interior layout that's very driver focused. Sadly, the Spider 1600 would be Battista Pininfarina's final design. He died just a few days after its official unveil. They chose to go a different route with the design, and this is a car that he's very much known for. It was somewhat divisive and somewhat controversial, but it's one of those designs that really lasted and showed his incredible skill at designing cars. With this car, they chose to go a different route than what was in vogue at this time. By the mid-60s, most manufacturers were moving away from, the very curvy designs. The Spider and the E-Type would remain the few of their kind that would stay this way as the rest of the world went to more angular designs, and the Spider would outlive the E-Type by about 20 years. At this point in 1966, the single most important place for a European manufacturer to display their new car was the Geneva Motor Show. It was here in '66 that Alfa would unveil their radical new Spider with much acclaim. There was just one problem though. The car was great, but the hardest part for Alfa was naming the damn car. All they could come up with was Spider 1600. So that's what they called it at its debut at the Geneva Motor Show. But one thing we expect to get from our exotic Italian car manufacturers is cool Italian model names. Spider 1600 ain't cutting it. We want something that we can barely pronounce and something that means literally nothing to us. It makes us feel special. So Alfa decided to do the dumbest thing possible and poll the entire world on what the name of this car should be. So if you could get to an Alfa dealer, you could enter your best idea or ideas to name this car, with as many entrants as you want, and the winner would get a brand new Spider 1600. And almost 150,000 ideas were entered. I wonder how many of those entrants were just jokes, like the Alfa Romeo Fart Knocker, or maybe the Alfa Romeo Spider-Man. Anyways, the name Duetto would end up taking the win. I don't know why, it's not the most exciting name, but I'm sure this was a somewhat successful way of getting eyes on their new car. Sadly, this would end up only being a nickname later on for trademark reasons, and the car would officially become the Veloce Spider. That's right, they weren't even able to officially keep this name, but hey, that guy got a free car, so good for him. As with virtually all sports cars at this time, the US market would be key for Alfa. With a price tag of just under $4K, it was a good amount more than, say, an MGB, but it was also quite a bit more car. Not necessarily more advanced as a vehicle, but much more hairy-chested, as they say. And it was Italian. But would it appeal to well-off American sports car enthusiasts? For the US launch of the new Spider, Alfa went all in by hosting a cruise. That's right, a cruise. From Genoa, Italy to New York. US journalists were aboard alongside higher-ups at the Italian state broadcasting and press companies, with 3 brand new Duetto Spiders hanging out in the lounge of the cruise. Because the best way to test a new car is on a ship. You didn't know that? Actually, they did get driven, with racers and testers ripping the cars around the deck. Once at New York, a large presentation was held in front of 1,300 attendees from various niches, not just in the automotive sector, many of which were famous and rich. It was all very strange and Italian, and honestly, it sounds pretty fun. We need more ridiculous stuff like this today. Instead, we just get cheesy presentations or trailers to watch on YouTube. The little Spider was popular in the States. It was attractive but unique, and it performed well in its class as a true sports car. Featured early on in its life in popular movies like The Graduate, it really became a desirable vehicle, though many journalists and testers through its entire lifetime found that the car's performance and character didn't always match up with its price. But Alfa would successfully address most of the car's problems through its run, while keeping the overall design of the car pretty much the same. Aside from upping the power with the 1750cc version, and then also releasing a junior 1290cc version, by its final year, the car did end up clearly dated. There's an interesting article from 1993 from Car and Driver pitting the Spider against 3 contemporary, comparatively priced convertibles: the Mazda Miata, the Mercury Capri XR2, and the Honda Civic Del Sol C. And let's just say that the little Spider didn't come out on top. Not even close, actually. Despite Alfa's updates to the model, even this 4th gen version was far beyond the likes of, for example, Mazda's Miata. They note that despite being the most expensive of the bunch at the time, it wasn't even in the same realm as the competitors that it was up against. It was, for all intents and purposes, by the 90s, a classic car. It was the very basic elements of car design that had changed so much over the course of its life from the 60s to the 90s that made the other 3 stand out as just modern cars. Things like steering response and chassis rigidity. And so, probably not because of this article, but who knows, the Alfa Romeo Spider would have its final year 1 year after the release of this article. A sports car of the same name would come out about a decade later. Sure, it wasn't exactly the same kind of sports car. Still, the Spider 4C, with Alfa now being owned by Fiat Chrysler, was pretty stinking cool and also very successful, but nothing compared to the original Spider Duetto in terms of overall success. Now, in the preface to his book on the Spider, and I've linked that book down below if you guys want to learn more about this car, Giancenzo Madaro notes the idea that cars themselves are in fact feminine, and asserts that the top-down Roadster is the most feminine of all. And if that's true, and we narrow down all of the most beautiful convertibles and Roadsters and Spiders through history, we'd have to include cars like the Austin Healey 100 and MGA and the E-Type, maybe the Ferrari California GT Spider, heck, I would even include the Miata, maybe the Shelby Cobra, the BMW 507, early Corvettes and Thunderbirds, obviously some Porsches, I guess. Okay, there's a bunch more I'd have to include, and of course this is something we can debate, but for me, when you throw the Alfa Romeo Spider in there, it kind of comes out on top as the most feminine of the most feminine types of cars. Despite my wife constantly calling Miatas girl cars, and despite the MGA having very nice hips, I would have to argue that this car, the Alfa Romeo Duetto Spider, though certainly not the greatest car of all time or the greatest of these cars, it is indeed the most feminine. Now, the question of why this car in particular was able to live on for so long is really interesting. Perhaps it was that feminine quality that made it stand out as cars changed. But I think there's more to it than just that. Between the death of the British Roadster and the release of the Miata, cute, fun, stylish top-down cars were all but gone, with pretty much only the Alfa Romeo Spider remaining alongside a few others, the Fiat 124 for example. Few cars like this existed in this space during this interim period between the popularity of convertibles in the 50s and 60s and then their resurgence in really the 90s. The allure of Italian sports cars isn't and hasn't really ever been about reliability. Usually any lack of reliability is because the cars are essentially ahead of their time, like the Spider was in its early years. So why would anyone in the early 90s spend significantly more money for a car that is unequivocally worse? Perhaps Car and Driver understood it. They say this in their 1993 article about the Spider. It's true that on a mild spring day, at a very relaxed pace over immaculate blacktop, the Alfa Spider offers a heartwarming, offbeat ride. And even after all these years, its clean shape remains attractive. Its top also flips down easily, almost as quickly and casually as the Miata's, though the boot covers, hooks, snaps, and zippers work awkwardly. But is that enough? Obviously, a few people still find the Alfa Spider irresistible. The company sells about 3 a day in the US. And those good folks will pay no attention to what we say anyway. But this car needs to be retired gracefully. It became an instant classic in 1967 when poor befuddled Dustin Hoffman chased up and down California in one, trying to come to grips with his life and a fetching Catherine Ross in The Graduate. We'd prefer to remember it that way, not see it continually shoved out to face rivals 25 years more modern. Even when the car was sunsetted, apparently Alfa was selling 3 a day, roughly 1,000 units per year, just to US customers. I mean, it's not that terrible, really. The sense you get is that sometimes rich people see something beautiful and exotic and they don't really know any better because they're not actually taking the time to research what these cars are. Like somebody who buys a Rolex covered in diamonds. There's a good chance they don't understand watches. Maybe their older, wealthier mentor bought one when he got that executive position, decades earlier, so they bought one too. Or maybe it was still a success because even though it had been 20 years older than its competition, maybe it was still the best looking, prettiest car in this class. Spider enthusiasts would say it's more than this. They would point to its success because of its heritage, its connection with Alfa's racing history, the fact that it was an alluring, limited production Italian sports car that was expensive but not too expensive, that it held an air of classic Italian styling, that at this point it was a cult classic, and I would say that all of those things are probably true as well. Regardless, this is a sports car that refused to die, and honestly, it probably could have kept going. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Subscribe and like the video if you want to support the channel. As always, comment below, and we'll see you in the next one. Drive safe.